In the first video in this introduction to using the PIE Abacus, we showed how you can set up a structure of multiple abacuses for your various teams to reflect your main ways, perhaps your original ways of organising your services, as you might have with any organisation chart. In this, the second in this series, we're now going to look a little more closely at how this works, but we'll change the focus from the overview of the agency and its senior management team to the point of view of these frontline teams. And we'll see how we can use all this to aid communications, planning and mutual support, and also to support innovation within your services. And then we'll also touch on how you can create further abacuses, not just for teams, but also for individuals, those with more cross-cutting roles that may span several services or divisions. In the first video, we used shape, colour and location on the page to indicate in diagram form how any agency, or in fact any network of services, might organise its services and teams by location, by setting, or by service user group. And we've seen there how you can also create more topic-specific abacus groupings to reflect any other more cross-cutting concerns, and how this can give a richer and more detailed picture of how your services are progressing overall, and where you might want to focus your efforts as an agency. For this next illustration, we'll need to take that original imagery a stage further. Here we'll be looking at teams of any kind, so we'll have a new shape, an almond, that simply means team, any kind of team. Then we want a symbol for the person who actually enters the data into any abacus. Now, the software developers who originally created this platform, the PIE Abacus team, they call this person a user, and we can use the same term here, although if it causes any confusion with service users, as it well might, as an alternative we could talk perhaps of a contributor, because they're contributing their views. When we have an individual who enters the data on behalf of their team, we call this person a scribe. It's a slightly archaic term. It's associated more with ancient Egypt or with a medieval court. And you might prefer some other image, perhaps a little less formal. On the whole, we do assume, nevertheless, that this person is giving the views of the team, whether gathered through informal conversations, from individual supervision, better still from an actual team discussion, and better still from a Pizazz on paper exercise, or a discussion with the PIE Abacus in the room, so to speak. Either way, since this user/contributor is the person with their fingers on the keyboard, here we'll use a more simplified image of fingers on a keyboard. So let's zoom in a little closer to show this. What we found though with the pilots is that many, and perhaps in the long run most services, will choose to create an abacus for each team so that they enter there only the data for their own service. The screen that you get is then a lot less crowded, and you can really see just where you're at and what you will want to tackle. But perhaps the main immediate added value is that having their own abacus for the team clearly gave these teams a sense of ownership over their assessment, which is really very important. And then they can share it with others in various ways. Some in the pilots, in fact, didn't then use the overlay feature at all, as the number of services that were using it was sufficiently small that it was quite workable for the PIE lead to get a sense of where each was at just from looking. As we saw in the first video though, with a larger number of teams and users, that gets less workable, harder to get the agency overview, and then it may be better to create various intermediary abacuses as we described there. If each team has its own abacus, that does put the overall cost up. That's because we propose to set the license fee on a sliding scale, increasing according to the number of users and the number of abacuses that any agency wants. But let's now see what else you can do to develop your support with more scope for peer support and buddying up, and also for sharing innovations in the way you work. And as we'll see, the one-to-one Team to Abacus does on the whole make this a little smoother. So here, let's assume we do have one team with one user stroke contributor as the scribe and one abacus. Well, we clearly aren't going to have one typical service to illustrate this. So we'll have to imagine 2 or 3, maybe 4, each with its own abacus assessment. But let's start imagining 2 services run by the same agency, both of which have self-assessed as quite lacking in one or more areas. Now that's not to say that they definitely are by some more objective measure. They may well be just new to the PIE approach, and they may be assessing themselves a little more nervously, more critically than they deserve. But they think they have a long way to go. So one option is to put them in touch, with their consent I assume, with each other. And this, in effect, is the beginnings of that final stage of peer review. You don't actually need any additional abacuses for this. You just suggest that they give each other permission to see each other's assessment. You can even restrict the areas they can view if you wish, perhaps until you're a little more confident or just a little less bashful. And we'll often find that services may be a little further down the line in developing as PIEs than perhaps they'd realised. So often we do hear people say, oh, well, actually we were doing some of this, we just didn't call it that, we didn't see it in those terms. And sometimes it takes a peer, a fellow traveller, to gently point this out. So there can be a useful role in the agency, with its overview, in identifying where it may help to buddy up services in this way, particularly if geographically they may be quite dispersed, so it wouldn't easily happen naturally. And incidentally, for some more ideas on keeping peer review quite informal and less scary, do take a look at the pages on the PIE link, including one called The Coffee Break Pizazz, for a very informal, quite conversational PIE's assessment, quote unquote. Alternatively, you could perhaps put 3 struggling teams in touch as a peer support group. Perhaps not much more than 3, or you might risk creating a sin bin group, the kids at the back of the class. So this may be better with perhaps 3 teams that are all new to the process and feeling underconfident, perhaps unduly, and it helps them get on board. Or perhaps you could put the struggling service or services in touch with 1 or more teams that are a little further advanced, a little more confident. Not perhaps very far advanced, or there might seem to be such a gulf between them that this can make it more difficult to share as peers. And at this point we can really see how, maybe when, having 1 abacus per team can allow you a more sensitive handling of those services that do need some extra support. But we can also take the same teaming up approach with just a handful of services perhaps that are ready and wanting to go further, maybe wanting to experiment with some new approach or some new technique that they might be trying out, something that would belong in the psychological models and techniques field of psychological awareness. Then, putting them in touch with each other, they can share any learning with each other on that specific area, with or without sharing the rest of their assessment. Or they might actually want to talk over what impact this innovation seems to have in other areas. Or, for that matter, to converse, what constraints there may be if other aspects of the service are not fully in line and not supportive of this innovation. So they might actually want to share a little more of their overall assessment insofar as it's relevant and helpful. In fact, for this they might even want to create a new abacus specifically for sharing practice and sharing their assessments in this new area of work, and then they can tease out some of the particular features they're looking at in ways that we'll describe later on, the drilling down and adding in. But at this point, this is teetering on the edge of using the PIE Abacus in research, and that's a whole new story, which we'll come to in another video. But this is a good point also to point out that all these teams, once they have a license code from yourselves, can also be invited to participate in any other collective assessments, including those set up by any other agency or some shared project, whether they share their own assessments there or whether they create a new abacus specifically for this project. This potential to use the PIE Abacus for practice, share, action learning and shared diagnosis of hindering factors that reach outside the agency opens up a whole new scope. We'll be covering all this in more detail in the next video on the PIE Abacus used as a tool for local audit of needs, hindrances and plans. But before we do go on to look at this, let's just double back to where we began this section with the idea of one user or one scribe per team. Because it's also quite possible to have individuals not just as team scribes, but as individuals in their own right, with their own views on where the service is at and what the issues are. Now there is a cost added to the license fee in having individuals as users in their own right, rather than as scribes for the team. The cost is the same, so this can quite quickly mount up, and depending on the agency and the nature of your work, you may want to use this quite sparingly. But the value added in the extra freedom and flexibility that an individual user/contributor then has to take part in a much wider range of community of practice shared discussions. This extra value can make this an attractive option for some staff or for some services. And especially as you can have such communities of practice both within the agency and outside with fellow professionals and opposite numbers anywhere. So in the FAQs on the PIE link, you'll find more ideas on where, when and why you might want individuals as users. There's also more on the PIE Abacus as a research tool, as we mentioned, and on the PIE Abacus in local needs audit. But we'll turn to that local needs audit in the next video.